This is Damon Fordham, professor of history at Virginia College, as well as an author of True Stories of Black South Carolina and several other works. Now, one of the least discussed aspects of American history and culture is that of the African American newspapers. Back in 1827, John B. Russwurm, who was the third black person to graduate from college in the United States, he graduated from Bowdoin University in the 1820s up in Maine. He and a gentleman by the name of Samuel Cornish established Freedom's Journal. And in their first edition, they stated their purpose. He said, "We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us." So from that day forward, you've had in many cities of a sizable black population, black newspapers. And this is the story about one really forgotten case of the importance of that. You see, in Spartanburg, South Carolina, which is the city in which I was born, there was a gentleman by the name of Laban Morgan. Now, he was a really interesting guy. It turns out that he was one of the founders of what is today known as Cornerstone Baptist Church in that city. And he also was the founder of several black newspapers, and among other things. He was also the head of a local civil rights organization in Spartanburg, and in the year 1912, he served as one of the delegates to the Republican Convention that year. I believe that's the one where Theodore Roosevelt split off and became the Progressive Party. But in either case, though, Laban Morgan's story would pretty much been forgotten, except for a couple of things. You see, in 1921, you had another fellow in Spartanburg named Dr. John W. Sexton. He was one of the city's black pharmacists, and he also had his own drugstore that supplied the black community in those days. Now, what's interesting about all of this and how all of this plays in the role of history is that on July the 30th, 1921, Dr. John W. Sexton wrote a letter to a black newspaper in Columbia, South Carolina, called the Columbia Southern Indicator. And in it, he told the almost forgotten story about Laban Morgan. He spoke about how Laban Morgan owned and operated for many years the Spartanburg Piedmont Indicator in the early 1900s. However, in spite of all of the good things that he did for his community, Dr. Sexton reported that Morgan and his family lived for 30 years from hand to mouth, trying to establish his newspaper as a voice for blacks in Spartanburg, and that he went through poverty and destitution of his wife and children. But, as Dr. Sexton put it in his letter, he stuck to his paper until his last breath is drawn. Now he is dead, and no one appreciates him. However, Dr. Sexton was so grateful for what Laban Morgan did to inform his community that he went on to make arrangements with Mr. A.M. Christianberg, who was the manager of the First National Bank in Spartanburg, which was at that time on the city's Main Street, not too far from the statue of the Revolutionary War hero Daniel Morgan. And he said that he made an agreement that whenever Mrs. Morgan needed some money, Mr. Christianberg would loan it to her with the understanding that Dr. Sexton would pay it back, and through this they managed to send their son Buster to Claflin College in Orangeburg, South Carolina. Dr. Sexton himself passed away in 1924, and he's buried in Lincoln Gardens, which is a black cemetery in Spartanburg, which in fact many of my ancestors are also buried. But I wouldn't have known about this story at all, except for the fact that for a number of years I worked in the Charleston County Library with newspaper microfilms. So I was able to look through all these forgotten stories and old newspapers, and I came across the Columbia Southern Indicator of June the 30th, 1921, and came across this story, which I later reproduced in my book, True Stories of Black South Carolina. And there are several things to say about this. Number one, had it not been for the black press, a lot of the history of African Americans would have gone completely to the graveyards, as well as other histories about other things, because a lot of things in the newspapers are quickly forgotten. But if you look through old newspapers, they happen to be a treasure trove of history that otherwise would have been forgotten. And especially this wonderful story about man's friendship and his desire to preserve the story of this other individual. Sadly, no issues of the Spartanburg Piedmont indicator that Laban Morgan produced are still with us, but this story exists for us to learn from today. This is Damon Fordham.